So if you review Martin Luther King's speech Beyond Vietnam, everything he talked about in there is still relevant today. All that's changed is that now you can have a black president doing all the same things. So the same system was actually pursued in apartheid South Africa, where the foundations were also pivotal in not only creating the apartheid system, such as the Rockefeller Foundation helped in that establishment, but in changing it. So that in the 70s, in 1978 actually, the major foundations held study groups in the United States on changing policy in South Africa. And they saw the radical ANC, very socialist, reformist, radical, almost revolutionary, well, it was revolutionary, agenda that they had. And so they saw this change coming. And South Africa is simply too important for imperial interests. It always has been, it always will be. So it's unacceptable to have a revolutionary movement, liberation struggle come up. So what they did was that they supported, again, the more legally oriented measures. They created NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and the foundations and the NGOs even ended up writing the Constitution. And all the radical revolutionary changes that were in the original documents of the ANC were gone from the Constitution. And while political apartheid changed, social apartheid remains. The only difference is that you have black faces in government and black faces on the boards of mining companies. And these were the people who were often foundation funded, NGO leaders. So this is a way of engineering consent. So you change the image, slight reforms, but the system must remain the same.
So finally, then, what would you say to people who say that the most egregious abuses of these foundations, the creation of the eugenics movement or the suppression of the civil rights movement or things like that are in the past, and that these days the foundations are by and large working towards things that we can all agree on as good, such as vaccination of third world countries?
Well, you have to generally look a little deeper into the issues, and it's really not that hidden. As you brought up, the stuff is generally open, it's just not looked at. That's the problem. We need more discussion, more examination of the role of foundations. For example, what they're doing today, just take the entire world enclave of NGOs, non-governmental organizations. Now, these are generally viewed with respect. They're promoting social change, attempting to alleviate poverty, discuss human rights, at least challenge in some respects institutions like the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, IMF, etc. Well, the rise of NGOs was actually foundation engineered, and it was with a very specific purpose. Now, the aim is that well, it resulted out of the age of what's called structural adjustment, where the World Bank and IMF imposed structural adjustment programs on places like Africa, Latin America, and Asia. This essentially amounted to social genocide, where they wiped out education, healthcare, social services, expanded poverty, created mass inflation, essentially recolonized the entire third world, so-called third world, for the Western imperial powers. This rapid acceleration of poverty created enormous social unrest. So in this context, elites always get very insecure. If there's massive social unrest, you need to address it. You need to create consent to the system. This is the context in which NGOs rose up globally. Now, NGOs today essentially act in the modern imperial project as the missionary groups acted in the old formal colonial period. Now, if you look at missionary societies, the leadership often knew very directly and were very complicit in the fact that this was an imperial project. Missionary groups going to Africa in the 1800s, early 1900s, it was very explicitly imperial. However, the missionaries on the ground often were people with good intentions, just wanting to help, educate, civilize the barbarians, what have you. I mean, the aim essentially on their part, on the individual lower level missionaries, was that they had good intentions. But the effect was that while slightly addressing issues of education, alleviating poverty, these types of issues, they were undermining the local indigenous cultures, religions, heritages, language, history, society itself. And thus they made it not only susceptible, but deeply, they were able to essentially undermine that whole system and make the colonial political and economic overt colonial oppression sustainable. And the NGOs function in the same way today. While going to places like Africa, they slightly alleviate poverty, slightly address human rights issues, education issues, a whole plethora of other social issues and concepts. Now, the people working on the ground for the NGOs are there with great intentions. I study political science, and the people who study political science who tend to want to change things, don't like the established political or economic order, they tend to go into the NGO world because that's where people with good intentions generally go in this field. And so the people have good intentions, but the leadership and the actual global social role of the foundations is that ultimately they undermine local indigenous movements for liberation because, again, they promote ideology, this sort of Western imperial ideology that we know best and we can help Africans come to terms with what it really means to have good government, our concept of human rights, our concept of democracy, our concept of freedom and liberty, and these types of issues. So we promote, again, Western ideology upon African society, slightly alleviating poverty, slightly addressing social issues, filling the void that the state used to fill in these countries, but that the World Bank and IMF forced them to eliminate. So the NGOs come in and slightly alleviate these issues. However, they ultimately undermine indigenous resistance and radical or revolutionary change because they essentially make people complacent to the system. In that sense, they produce consent, which is the ultimate aim, again, of the foundations. And so they are essentially modern missionaries. And even the anti-globalization movement, as it's referred to, is organized, say, for example, at the World Social Forum, which started in 2001. This is a huge meeting of NGOs, NGO leaders, etc. It's Ford Foundation funded, along with several other foundations. But the Ford Foundation essentially founded the World Social Forum. And it brings together all these NGOs, purportedly under the guise of an anti-globalization movement. But what happens is that with huge infusions of cash and organization from the foundations, NGOs become professionalized. So suddenly people who were once activists out on the street picketing with gas masks in case the police became oppressive, suddenly they're salaried employees attending major international meetings with the World Trade Organization, with the World Bank, hobnobbing with elites. Their salaries increases, they go to the think tanks, they go to the big meetings. Suddenly the system they were once against is now supporting them and has not only professionalized them, but given them status, prestige, and acknowledgement. And for people who are often oppressed by society, who criticize and have been pushed down by the powers that be, this is a very intoxicating change for them. And so the system that they were once against is now supporting them. So for them, the idea of a radical revolutionary or systemic change is no longer on the agenda. It's about reform, mild reforms to the system. And essentially, it's not anti-globalization. It's just reform globalization. It's putting a human face on an inhuman entity. It's about making globalization itself more sustainable and providing consent on a more global scale to this system.
Well, a fascinating subject and one which you've obviously done quite a great deal of research into. So if people are more interested in finding out about this history and the ways that the foundations function in our society, how can they find out more about your work?
Well, you can go to globalresearch.ca. I've written some articles on covering issues that foundations cover, but I'm also writing a current book on global governance, which has foundations as a major subject throughout the entire thing.
Excellent. Well, I look forward to that book, and hopefully we can have you on when that comes out. But Andrew Gavin Marshall, it's always a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you for taking the time today.
Thank you very much.